Hello and welcome to the podcast. This is Ron's Amazing Stories, where we play tales to take you away from today. You know, time is a funny thing. We want to savor every moment, but then we just can't wait. I would say that time is fickle, but the truth is we are. Time plays a huge role in this week's show. We have a story about a hitman displaced in time and one of a memory from another time. So, let's start our travels with this moment in time.
And now, a moment in time.
The date is August 31st, 1961. What you're about to hear is a Universal News Brief story. It gives us a brief glimpse at what life was like during the building of the Berlin Wall.
Protection of Allied troops go about their daily tasks, well aware that their divided city has been pounced upon by Khrushchev as his frail reason for resuming atom bomb tests. They know, as President Kennedy said, that Khrushchev is testing more than bombs. He is testing the will and determination of the free world through atomic blackmail. Nevertheless, no one is going to stop a British schoolboy from going to classes if it takes every one of England's troops in Berlin. They stand by to convoy Erwin Shave, age 12. He lives in a section of West Berlin surrounded by red territory except for an 8-foot lane. One day, East German soldiers stepped from the weeds and told him to go home. His parents complained, and Her Majesty's troops took over. Daily, the harassment by the East Germans goes on. They have sealed off famed St. Hedwig's Cathedral, and West Germans can no longer worship at the church where their forefathers were christened and were buried. The communists have never learned that they can never erect a wall between the faithful and their God. The boots of East German soldiers on never-ending patrol sound a tattoo of oppression. Love conquers the old brick wall. A young couple in East Berlin, separated from the bride's mother in the West, wave to the tearful woman. Scenes of heartbreak that are daily occurrence as families are torn apart by the wall of hate. The tears of a mother, the sadness of a bride. That is Berlin today.
What do I have to say? Well, we have a follow-up to our moment in time. For the third time, Tom Williams is back, and he has a tale that took place about 2 months later. The place is Berlin, Germany, and the date is October of 1961. Hello, Ron. I sure hope I'm not being a bore. If so, just ignore my rantings. I have an excuse. I'm old. Wink. I believe that I can connect two themes in one email. They are getting older and the day the Earth stood still, which, by the way, connects your last show about astronauts returning to Earth and discovering that the planet has been destroyed by war. Well, Tom, to me, those seem like three very different things, but hey, I'm game. Here's Tom again. On getting older. As I get older, I understand why my relatives wanted to tell me their stories of their youth. I'm doing the same thing now. And as for the day the Earth stood still, It happened to me as I sat atop a personnel carrier facing off the East German tanks in October of 1961, right here in Berlin. So here's how the story goes. As a combat engineer in 1961 and the height of the Cold War, my company was assigned to the Berlin Brigade because the wall was being built. West Berlin was 100 miles into communist East German territory. As a matter of fact, we were the only troops who ever were surrounded in a communist territory. Shortly after arriving in October, the day the earth stood still, we were issued weapons and were sent to Checkpoint Charlie. I was positioned on top of a personnel carrier. We knew that at any moment, if there was a wrong move on either side, World War III would begin. As I was facing the east, I knew that those other soldiers didn't want to be there either, but here we were, waiting and praying. Suddenly, I heard a bang and instantly looked up to see where the sound came from. With my heart in my throat, my buddy on the left tapped me on the arm and pointed down to the street. There stood a senior citizen holding up 3 bananas for me and my buddies, saying, "Thank you." She and the other West Berliners never knew until years later how close we all came to the end that day. Not even the street sweeper who was cleaning in front of our armored carrier. A heartening incident occurred about a month later. We had the right to pass into the East Sector at any time without hindrance. One day, to prove to the East we would exercise this right, we were placed on a military bus and passed through Checkpoint Charlie. There wasn't any trouble other than one East German man walking through the bus to show his authority. At one point, we stopped at a traffic light, and as I looked out the window, I saw another elderly lady observing us. She looked to the left and then the right and slowly backed up between 2 buildings. Then she gave a little wave and a smile. I knew then that this whole thing was political and that there were people on the other side who did like us. A very touching moment. All the best, Tom. Well, Tom, I think you sealed that up rather nicely. To the listeners, I want to say that Tom has included a photograph of him on top of that personnel carrier, and if you want to see it, just head to the show notes. Thank you, Tom.
As read by. Amazing stories read by amazing people.
This time on As Read By, we have a short story called Gun for Hire by Mack Reynolds. A Gun for Hire explores, in a lighthearted but painful way, the fact that hired guns are just that, hired. This story is amazing and speaks to us as much as it did when it was written in the 1950s for the pulp mags of the time. A Gun for Hire is read for us by Phil Chenevert, who does a truly impressive job.
Gun for Hire. Joe Prantera called softly, "Al." The pleasurable, comfortable, warm feeling began spreading over him, the way it always did. The older man stopped and squinted, but not suspiciously, even now. The evening was dark. It was unlikely that the other even saw the circle of steel that was the mouth of the shotgun barrel, now resting on the car's window ledge. "Who is it?" he growled. Joe Prantera said softly, "Big Louis sent me, Al." And he pressed the trigger. At that moment, the universe caved inward upon Joseph Marie Prantera. There was nausea and nausea upon nausea. There was a falling through all space and through all time. There was doubling and twisting and twitching of every muscle and nerve. There was pain, horror, and tumultuous fear. and he came out of it as quickly and completely as he'd gone in. He was in, he thought, a hospital, and his first reaction was to think, "This here California, everything different." Then his second thought was, something went wrong. Big Louis, he ain't going to like this. He brought his thinking to the present. So far as he could remember, he hadn't completely pulled the trigger. That at least meant that whatever the rap was, it wouldn't be too tough. With luck, the syndicate would get him off with a couple of years at Quentin. A door slid open in the wall, in a way that Joe had never seen a door operate before. This here California. The clothes on the newcomer were wrong, too. For the first time, Joe Prantera began to sense an alienness, a something that was awfully wrong. The other spoke precisely and slowly, the way a highly educated man speaks a language which he reads and writes fluently, but has little occasion to practice vocally. "You have recovered?" Joe Prantera looked at the other expressionlessly. Maybe the old duck was one of those foreign doctors like. The newcomer said, "You have undoubtedly been through a most harrowing experience. If you have any untoward symptoms, possibly I could be of assistance." Joe couldn't figure out how he stood. For one thing, there should have been some kind of police guard. The other said, "Perhaps a bit of stimulant." Joe said flatly, "I want a lawyer." The newcomer frowned at him. "A lawyer? I ain't saying nothing. Not until I get a mouthpiece." The newcomer started off on another tack. "My name is Lawrence Reston Farrell. If I am not mistaken, you are Joseph Salviati Prantera?" Salviati happened to be Joe's mother's maiden name. But it was unlikely this character could have known that. Joe had been born in Naples, and his mother had died in childbirth. His father hadn't brought him to the States until the age of 5, and by that time he had a stepmother. "I want a mouthpiece," Joe said flatly, "or let me out of here." Lawrence Reston Farrell said, "You are not being constrained. There are clothes for you in the closet there." Joe gingerly tried swinging his feet to the floor and sitting up, while the others stood watching him strangely. He came to his feet. With the exception of a faint nausea, which brought back memories of that extreme condition he'd suffered during what? He hadn't the vaguest idea of what had happened. He was dressed in a hospital-type nightgown. He looked down at it and snorted and made his way over to the closet. It opened on his approach, the door sliding back into the wall in much the same manner as the room's door had opened for Reston Farrell. Joe Prantera scowled and said, "These ain't my clothes." "No, I am afraid not." "You think I'd be seen dead wearing this stuff? What is this, some religious crackpot hospital?" Reston Farrell said, "I am afraid, Mr. Salviati Prantera, that these are the only garments available. I suggest you look out the window there." Joe gave him a long, chill look, and then stepped to the window. He couldn't figure the other, unless he was a fruitcake. Maybe he was in some kind of pressure cooker, and this was one of the fruitcakes. He looked out, however, not on the lawns and walks of a sanitarium, but upon a wide boulevard of what was obviously a populous city. And for a moment again, Joe Prantera felt the depths of nausea. This was not his world. He stared for a long, long moment. The cars didn't even have wheels, he noted dully. He turned slowly and faced the older man. Reston Farrell said compassionately, "Try this, it's excellent cognac." Joe Prantera stared at him, and finally, flatly, "What's it all about?" The other put down the unaccepted glass. "We were afraid first realization would be a shock to you," he said. "My colleague is in the adjoining room. We will be glad to explain to you if you will join us there." "I want to get out of here," Joe said. "Where would you go?" The fear of police, of Al Rossi's vengeance, of the measures that might be taken by Big Louie on his failure, were now far away. Reston Farrell had approached the door by which he had entered, and it reopened for him. He went through it without looking back. There was nothing else to do. Joe dressed, then followed him. In the adjoining room was a circular table that would have accommodated a dozen persons. Two were seated there now, papers, books, and soiled coffee cups before them. There had evidently been a long wait. Reston Farrell, the one Joe had already met, was tall and drawn of face with a chain-smoker's nervousness. The other was heavier and more at ease. They were both, Joe estimated, somewhere in their middle 50s. They both looked like docs. He wondered all over again if this was some kind of pressure cooker. But that didn't explain the view from the window. Reston Farrell said, "May I present my colleague, Citizen Warren Brett James? Warren, this is our guest from yesteryear, Mr. Joseph Salviati Prantera." Brett James looked at him, friendly so far as Joe could see. He said gently, "I think it would be Mr. Joseph Prantera, wouldn't it? The maternal lineage was almost universally ignored." His voice, too, gave the impression he was speaking a language not usually on his tongue. Joe took an empty chair, hardly bothering to note its alien qualities. His body seemed to fit into the pieces of furniture, as though it had been molded to his order. Joe said, "I think maybe I'll take that there drink, Doc." Reston Farrell said, "Of course," and then something else Joe didn't get. Whatever the something else was, a slot opened in the middle of the table, and a glass, so clear of texture as to be all but invisible, was elevated. It contained possibly 3 ounces of golden fluid. Joe didn't allow himself to think of its means of delivery. He took up the drink and bolted it. He put the glass down and said carefully, "What's it all about, huh?" Warren Brett James said soothingly, "Prepare yourself for somewhat of a shock, Mr. Prantera. You are no longer in Los Angeles." "You think I'm stupid? I can see that." "I was about to say, Los Angeles of 1960. Mr. Prantera, we welcome you to Nuevo Los Angeles." "To where?" "To Nuevo Los Angeles and to the year—" Brett James looked at his companion. "What is the date, old calendar?" 2133, Reston Farrell said. 2133 A.D., they would say. Joe Prantera looked from one of them to the other, scowling. "What are you guys talking about?" Warren Brett James said softly, "Mr. Prantera, you are no longer in the year 1960. You are now in the year 2133. He said, uncomprehendingly, "You mean I've been, unconscious for—" He let the sentence fall away as he realized the impossibility. Brett James said gently, "Hardly for 170 years, Mr. Prantera." Reston Farrell said, "I am afraid we are confusing you. Briefly, we have transported you, I suppose one might say, from your own era to ours." Joe Prantera had never been exposed to the concept of time travel. He had simply never associated with anyone who had ever even remotely considered such an idea. Now he said, "You mean like I've been asleep all that time?" "Not exactly," Brett James said, frowning. Reston Farrell said, "Suffice to say you are now 173 years after the last memory you have." Joe Prantera's mind suddenly reverted to those last memories, and his eyes narrowed dangerously. He felt suddenly at bay. He said, "Maybe you guys better let me in on what's this all about." Reston Farrell said, "Mr. Prantera, we have brought you from your era to perform a task for us." Joe stared at him, and then at the other. He couldn't believe he was getting through to them, or at least they were to him. Finally he said, "If I get this, you want me to do a job for you?" "That is correct." Joe said, "You guys know what kind of jobs I do?" "That is correct." "Like hell you do. You think I'm stupid? I never even seen you before." Joe Prantera came abruptly to his feet. "I'm getting out of here." For the second time, Reston Farrell said, "Where would you go, Mr. Prantera?" Joe glared at him, then sat down again as abruptly as he'd risen. "Let's start all over again. I got this straight. You brought me, some screwy way, all the way here. Okay, I'll buy that. I seen what it looks like out that window." The real comprehension was seeping through to him even as he talked. "Everybody I know, Jesse, Tony, the kid, Big Louis, everybody, they're dead? Even Big Louis?" "Yes," Brett James said, his voice soft. "They are all dead, Mr. Prantera. Their children are all dead, and their grandchildren." The two men of the future said nothing more for long minutes, while Joe Prantera's mind whirled its confusion. Finally he said, "What's this bit about you wanting me to give it to some guy?" "That is why we brought you here, Mr. Prantera. You are a professional assassin." "Hey, wait a minute now." Reston Farrell went on, ignoring the interruption. "There is small point in denying your calling. Pray remember that at the point when we transported you, you were about to dispose of a contemporary named Alfonso Annunziata Rossi, a citizen, I might say, whose demise would probably have caused small dismay to society." "They had him pegged all right," Joe said. "But why me? Why don't you get some heavy from now? Somebody knows the ropes these days." Brett James said, "Mr. Prantera, there are no professional assassins in this age, nor have there been for over a century and a half." "Well, then do it yourself." Joe Prantera's irritation over this whole complicated mess was growing, and already he was beginning to long for the things he knew, for Jesse and Tony and the others, for his favorite bar, for the lasagna down at Papa Giovanni's. Right now, he would have welcomed a calling down at the hands of Big Louis. Reston Farrell had come to his feet and walked to one of the large room's windows. He looked out as though unseeing. Then, his back turned, he said, "We have tried, but it is simply not in us, Mr. Prantera." "You mean you're yellow?" "No, if by that you mean afraid. It is simply not within us to take the life of a fellow creature, not to speak of a fellow man." Joe snapped, "Everything you guys say sounds crazy. Let's start all over again." Brett James said, "Let me do it, Lawrence." He turned his eyes to Joe. "Mr. Prantera, in your own era, did you ever consider the future?" Joe looked at him blankly. "In your day, you were confronted with national and international problems, just as we are today, and just as nations were a century or a millennium ago." "Sure, okay, so we had problems. I know what you mean, like wars and depressions and dictators and like that." "Yes, like that," Brett James nodded. The heavy-set man paused a moment. "Yes, like that," he repeated. "That we confront you now indicates that the problems of your day were solved. Hadn't they been, the world most assuredly would have destroyed itself. Wars. Our pedagogues are hard put to convince their students that such ever existed. More than a century and a half ago, our society eliminated the reasons for international conflict. For that matter, he added musingly, we eliminated most international boundaries. Depressions, shortly after your own period, man awoke to the fact that he had achieved to the point where it was possible to produce an abundance for all with a minimum of toil. Overnight, for all practical purposes, the whole world was industrialized, automated. The second industrial revolution was accompanied by revolutionary changes in almost every field, certainly in every science. Dictators? Your ancestors found, Mr. Prantera, that it is difficult for a man to be free so long as others are still enslaved. Today, the democratic ethic has reached a pinnacle never dreamed of in your own era. Okay, Joe Prantera growled. So everybody's got it made. What I want to know is, what's all this about me giving it to somebody? If everything's so great, how come you want me to knock this guy off? Reston Farrell bent forward and thumped his right index finger twice on the table. The bacterium of hate, a new strain, has found the human race unprotected from its disease. We had thought our vaccines immunized us. What's that supposed to mean? Brett James took up the ball again. Mr. Prantera, have you ever heard of Genghis Khan, of Tamerlane, Alexander, Caesar? Joe Prantera scowled at him emptily. Or, more likely, of Napoleon, Hitler, Stalin? Sure, I heard of Hitler and Stalin, Joe growled. I ain't stupid. The other nodded. Such men are unique. They have a drive to power which exceeds by far the ambitions of the average man. They are genii in their way, Mr. Prantera, genii of evil. Such a genius of evil has appeared on the current scene. Now we're getting somewheres, Joe snorted. So you got a guy what's a little ambitious like, eh? And you guys ain't got the guts to give it to him. Okay, what's in it for me? The two of them frowned, exchanged glances. Reston Farrell said, You know, that is one aspect we had not considered. Brett James said to Joe Prantera, Had we not, taken you at the time we did, do you realize what would have happened? Sure, Joe grunted. I would have let old Al Rossi have it right in the guts 5 times. Then I would have took the plane back to Chi. Brett James was shaking his head. No. You see, by coincidence, a police squad car was coming down the street just at that time to arrest Mr. Rossi. You would have been apprehended. As I understand California law of the period, your life would have been forfeit, Mr. Prantera. Joe winced. It didn't occur to him to doubt their word. Reston Farrell said, As to reward, Mr. Prantera, we have already told you there is ultra-abundance in this age. Once this task has been performed, we will sponsor your entry into present-day society. Competent psychiatric therapy will soon remove your present... Wait a minute now. You figure on getting me candled by some head shrinker, eh? No thanks, Buster. I'm going back to my own... Brett James was shaking his head again. I am afraid there is no return, Mr. Prantera. Time travel works but in one direction, with the flow of time stream. There can be no return to your own era. Joe Prantera had been rocking with the mental blows he had been assimilating, but this was the final haymaker. He was stuck in this Squaresville of a world. Joe Prantera on a job was thorough, careful, painstaking, competent. He spent the first 3 days of his life in the year 2133 getting the feel of things. Brett James and Reston Farrell had been appointed to work with him. Joe didn't meet any of the others who belonged to the group which had taken the measures to bring him from the past. He didn't want to meet them. The fewer persons involved, the better. He stayed in the apartment of Reston Farrell. Joe had been right. Reston Farrell was a medical doctor. Brett James evidently had something to do with the process that had enabled them to bring Joe from the past. Joe didn't know how they'd done it, and he didn't care. Joe was a realist. He was here. The thing was to adapt. There didn't seem to be any hurry. Once the deal was made, they left it up to him to make the decisions. They drove him around the town when he wished to check the traffic arteries. They flew him about the whole vicinity. From the air, Southern California looked much the same as it had in his own time. Oceans, mountains, and to a lesser extent deserts, are fairly permanent even against man's corroding efforts. It was while he was flying with Brett James on the second day that Joe said, "How about Mexico? Can I make the get to Mexico?" The physicist looked at him questioningly. "Get?" he said. Joe Prantera said impatiently, "The getaway. After I give it to this Howard Temple Tracy guy, I gotta go on the run, don't I?" "I see." Brett James cleared his throat. "Mexico is no longer a separate nation, Mr. Prantera. All North America has been united into one unit. Today there are only 8 nations in the world." "Where's the nearest?" "South America." "That's a hell of a long way to go on a get." "We hadn't thought of the matter being handled in that manner." Joe eyed him in scorn. "Oh, you didn't, huh? What happens after I give it to this guy? I just sit around and wait for the cops to put the arm on me?" Brett James grimaced in amusement. "Mr. Prantera, this will probably be difficult for you to comprehend, but there are no police in this era." Joe gaped at him. "No police? What happens if you gotta throw some guy in stir?" "If I understand your idiom correctly, you mean prison. There are no prisons in this era, Mr. Prantera." Joe stared. "No cops? No jails? What stops anybody? What stops anybody from just going into some bank-like and collecting up all the bread?" Brett James cleared his throat. "Mr. Prantera, there are no banks." "No banks? You gotta have banks." "And no money to put in them. We found it a rather antiquated method of distribution well over a century ago." Joe had given up. Now he merely stared. Brett James said reasonably, "We found we were devoting as much time to financial matters in all their endless ramifications, including bank robberies, as we were to productive efforts. So we turned to more efficient methods of distribution." On the 4th day, Joe said, "Okay, let's get down to facts. Some of the things you guys say don't stick together so good. Now, first place, where's this guy, Temple Tracy, you want knocked off?" Reston Farrell and Brett James were both present. The 3 of them sat in the living room of the latter's apartment, sipping a sparkling wine which seemed to be the prevailing beverage of the day. For Joe's taste, it was insipid stuff. Happily, rye was available to those who wanted it. Reston Farrell said, "You mean, where does he reside? Why, here in this city?" "Well, that's handy, eh?" Joe scratched himself thoughtfully. "You got somebody can finger him for me?" "Finger him?" Look, before I can give it to this guy, I gotta know someplace where he'll be at some time. Get it? Like Al Rossi. My finger, he works in Rossi's house, see? He lets me know every Wednesday night, 8 o'clock, Al leaves the house all by himself. Okay, so I can make plans like to give it to him. Joe Prantera wound it up reasonably. You gotta have a finger. Brett James said, why not just go to Temple Tracy's apartment and, dispose of him? Just walk in, eh? You think I'm stupid? How do I know how many witnesses hanging around? How do I know if the guy's carrying heat? Heat? A gun. You think I'm stupid? I come to give it to him and he gives it to me instead. Dr. Reston Farrell said, Howard Temple Tracy lives alone. He customarily receives visitors every afternoon, largely potential followers. He is attempting to recruit members to an organization he is forming. It would be quite simple for you to enter his establishment and dispose of him. I assure you he does not possess weapons. Joe was indignant. Just like that, eh? He said sarcastically. Then what happens? How do I get out of the building? Where's my get car parked? Where do I hide out? Where do I dump the heat? Dump the heat. Get rid of the gun. You want I should get caught with the gun on me? I'd wind up in the gas chamber so quick. See here, Mr. Prantera, Brett James said softly. We no longer have capital punishment, you must realize. Okay, I still don't want to get caught. What is the rap these days, huh? Joe scowled. You said they didn't have no jails anymore. This is difficult for you to understand, I imagine, Reston Farrell told him, but you see we no longer punish people in this era. That took a long, unbelieving moment to sink in. You mean, like, no matter what they do? That's crazy. Everybody'd be running around giving it to everybody else. The motivation for crime has been removed, Mr. Prantera, Reston Farrell attempted to explain. A person who commits a violence against another is obviously in need of medical care, and consequently receives it. You mean, like if I steal a car or something, they just take me to a doctor? Joe Prantera was unbelieving. Why would anyone wish to steal a car? Reston Farrell said easily. But if I give it to somebody, you will be turned over to a medical institution. Citizen Howard Temple Tracy is the last man you will ever kill, Mr. Prantera. A chilliness was in the belly of Joe Prantera. He said, very slowly, very dangerously, You guys figure on me getting caught, don't you? Yes, Brett James said evenly. Well then, figure something else. You think I'm stupid? Mr. Prantera, Dr. Reston Farrell said, there has been as much progress in the field of psychiatry in the past 2 centuries as there has in any other. Your treatment would be brief and painless, believe me. Joe said coldly. And what happens to you guys? How do you know I won't rat on you? Brett James said gently, the moment after you have accomplished your mission, we plan to turn ourselves over to the nearest institution to have determined whether or not we also need therapy. Now I'm beginning to wonder about you guys, Joe said. Look, all over again. What do you want to give it to this guy for? The doctor said, We explained the other day, Mr. Prantera. Citizen Howard Temple Tracy is a dangerous, atavistic, evil genius. We are afraid for our institutions if his plans are allowed to mature. Well, if you got things so good, everybody's got it made, like, who'd listen to him? The doctor nodded at the validity of the question. Mr. Prantera, Homo sapiens is a unique animal. Physically, he matures at approximately the age of 13. However, mental maturity and adjustment is often not fully realized until 30 or even more. Indeed, it is sometimes never achieved. Before such maturity is reached, our youth are susceptible to romantic appeal. Nationalism, chauvinism, racism, the supposed glory of the military, all seem romantic to the immature. They rebel at the orderliness of present society. They seek entertainment in excitement. Citizen Temple Tracy is aware of this and finds his recruits among the young. Okay, so this guy is dangerous. You want him knocked off before he screws everything up? But the way things are, there's no way of making a get. So you'll have to get some other patsy, not me. I am afraid you have no alternative, Brett James said gently. Without us, what will you do? Mr. Prantera, you do not even speak the language. What do you mean? I don't understand some of the big words you eggheads use, but I get by okay. Brett James said, Amer English is no longer the language spoken by the man in the street, Mr. Prantera. Only students of such subjects may any longer speak such tongues as Amer English, French, Russian, or the many others that once confused the race with their limitations as a means of communication. You mean there's no place in the whole world where they talk American? Joe demanded, aghast. Dr. Reston Farrell controlled the car. Joe Prantera sat in the seat next to him, and Warren Brett James sat in the back. Joe had, tucked in his belt, a .45 caliber automatic, once displayed in a museum. It had been more easily procured than the ammunition to fit it, but that problem, too, had been solved. The others were nervous, obviously repelled by the very conception of what they had planned. Inwardly, Joe was amused. Now that they had got in the clutch, the others were on the verge of chickening out. He knew it wouldn't have taken much for them to cancel the project. It wasn't any answer, though. If they allowed him to call it off today, they'd talk themselves into it again before the week was through. Besides, already Joe was beginning to feel the comfortable, pleasurable, warm feeling that came to him on occasions like this. He said, You sure this guy talks American, huh? Warren Brett James said, Quite sure. He is a student of history. And he won't think it's funny I talk American to him, huh? He'll undoubtedly be intrigued. They pulled up before a large apartment building that overlooked the area once known as Wilmington. Joe was coolly efficient now. He pulled out the automatic, held it down below his knees, and threw a shell into the barrel. He eased the hammer down, thumbed on the safety, stuck the weapon back in his belt and beneath the jacket-like garment he wore. He said, Okay, see you guys later. He left them and entered the building. An elevator, he still wasn't used to their speed in this era, whooshed him to the penthouse duplex occupied by Citizen Howard Temple Tracy. There were 2 persons in the reception room, but they left on Joe's arrival without bothering to look at him more than glancingly. He spotted the screen immediately and went over and stood before it. The screen lit and revealed a heavy-set, dour-of-countenance man seated at a desk. He looked into Joe Prantera's face, scowled, and said something. Joe said, Joseph Salviati Prantera to interview Citizen Howard Temple Tracy. The other's shaggy eyebrows rose. Indeed, he said. In Amer English? Joe nodded. Enter, the other said. A door had slid open on the other side of the room. Joe walked through it and into what was obviously an office. Citizen Temple Tracy sat at a desk. There was only one other chair in the room. Joe Prantera ignored it and remained standing. Citizen Temple Tracy said, "What can I do for you?" Joe looked at him for a long moment. Then he reached down to his belt and brought forth the .45 automatic. He moistened his lips. Joe said softly, "You know what this here is?" Temple Tracy stared at the weapon. "It's a handgun. Circa, I would say, about 1925 old calendar. What in the world are you doing with it?" Joe said very slowly, "Chief, in the line you're in these days, you need a heavy round with one of these. Otherwise, Chief, you're gonna wind up in some gutter with a lot of holes in you. What I'm doing, I'm asking for a job. You need a good man knows how to handle one of these, Chief." Citizen Howard Temple Tracy eyed him appraisingly. "Perhaps," he said, "you are right at that. In the near future, I may well need an assistant knowledgeable in the field of violence. Tell me more about yourself. You surprise me considerably." "Sure, Chief. It's kinda a long story, though. First off, I better tell you got some bad enemies, Chief. Two guys special named Brett James and Doc Reston Farrell. I think one of the first jobs I'm gonna have to do for you, Chief, is to give it to those two." End of Gun for Hire by Mack Reynolds.
Thank you, Phil. That was amazing. The author for this tale was Dallas McCord Reynolds. He was an American science fiction writer. His work is best known for its focus on socio-economic speculation. Now that's a whole lot of word power that simply means how money and people impact the future. He liked to write thought-provoking stories of perfect societies from a comic or satiric point of view. Reynolds' heroes usually seek to improve their societies by direct revolutionary action. Sometimes their revolution is meant to advance a people's level of civilization. Other times, to set it back to a more simple way of life. Either way, we salute Mr. Reynolds and thank him for his stories.
The Jell-O program, starring Jack Benny with Mary Livingston and Phil Harris and his orchestra. The orchestra opens the program with Boo-Hoo. Shopping, movies, bridge. Many women are likely to spend their afternoons these days in one of those three ways. But shopping, movies, or bridge sometimes means that you get home a little late and have to hurry with dinner. But never mind that, even if you have less time than usual. You can always serve a dessert you'll be proud of. Jell-O. Jell-O takes so little time to prepare, and it tastes downright delicious. Your whole family will enjoy Jell-O's true fruit flavor. Flavor that comes from fresh, ripe fruit. Try strawberry, raspberry, cherry, orange, lemon, or lime, but be sure you get the real thing. Be sure you get genuine Jell-O. Accept no substitutes, because only genuine Jell-O has that extra rich, fresh fruit flavor. Remember to look for the big red letters on the box. They spell Jell-O. Jell-O.
Another 5-minute mystery.
This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Mack Reynolds. The next time you seek to create a utopian society, then you need Mack Reynolds. He has written more about the perfect society than anyone ever. So slay anything in your way and call out for Mack Reynolds.
It is late afternoon in a small seaboard town, and in an old-fashioned house, old Doc Tucker is resting in his office, waiting for his housekeeper to bring him a cup of his beloved black coffee.
Doc Tucker, if you don't quit using that new operating table for a couch, if you knew how it scares a body to walk in here and see you stretched out there
better
like...
than a couch, Carrie. It's adjustable. As long as I was foolish enough to buy this contraption, I might as well...
I'll get it, Doctor.
Is there a doctor here? I saw the sign. My friend, we were hunting. The gun went off.
Good heavens, bring him right in. Doctor!
I'm here, Carrie. Here, young fella, put him right down here.
How is he, Doctor?
A shotgun can make an awful mess of a man. Doesn't seem to be any buckshot in him, except right here where it almost tore a hole through his chest.
But how is he?
Well, I'm afraid there's not much we can do for you, friend, young fella. He's dead. Feel better now? Sort of keeled over. What's this all about?
My name is Johnson. Bertrand Johnson. His name is Billings. We were partners in business.
I see. I'll have to know what happened for my report.
Well, as I said, we were out hunting near here. That is, he was. Golf is my game. And today, he taught me how to aim and fire a shotgun.
This accident, if you could maybe tell me just how it happened.
As I told you, he'd been showing me how to aim the gun, and then some birds flew out of the bushes up ahead of us. He told me to go after them.
You only had this one gun between you?
Yes, Billings owned it.
So you went after the birds?
Every time I got near them, they flew away. I kept following them. I guess I must have lost track of direction. I saw something move in a bush and shot at it. It was Billings.
How could you make a mistake like that?
I don't know. But the bush was very thick, and it was so far away.
Far away?
Well, it must have been at least 50 yards.
Excuse me. Carrie, can you come in here a minute?
Yes, Doctor.
Here, Carrie, I want you to make a phone call. Number is on this slip of paper.
I'll leave my name and address, Doctor, and the name of my partner's wife. If you could telephone her before I attempt to break the news.
It won't be necessary. Your name and address, I mean.
I don't understand.
That was the sheriff I asked Carrie to get on the phone. Until he gets here, I'm holding you for murder.
What makes the doctor suspect that what appears to be a typical hunting accident is deliberate murder? Do you know the clue? We'll learn in a moment. But first...
You know, I've always thought that the shotgun was a poor choice for a murder weapon. They are so hard to contain and... Wait a minute. Do you think the doctor knows a bit about shotguns? Do you? That might explain why he thinks this is a murder. Let's head back and see. This 5-minute mystery is being brought to you by Mack Reynolds, the maker of Utopia.
Now, back to our story.
Doctor, you've no right to accuse me like this.
A little while ago, young fella, you were asking me how bad your friend was hurt, as if you didn't know. Then you told me Billings was behind a bush about 50 yards away when this accident happened. Anybody who knows about shotguns knows that the farther away the target is, the more the pattern of buckshot spreads out. The pattern of buckshot in Billings' body proves that it was no accident, that you couldn't have been more than a few feet from him when you pulled the trigger. No, my friend, your alibi missed its mark.
So the deal was the shotgun pattern. I guess that's why they named them shotguns. This 5-minute mystery was brought to you by Mack Reynolds. The next time you seek to create a utopian society, then you need Mack Reynolds. So slay anything in your way and call out for Mack Reynolds. I hope that you enjoyed this week's podcast. Coming up is going to be a bit of a mystery, even to me. Jason and I are planning the Horror Express number 16, but it's looking like it will be sometime in June. More on that later. Of course, we will be back next week with something, so stay tuned for that. If you want to keep up with what's happening on Ron's Amazing Stories, please follow us on Twitter, Facebook, or sign up for the weekly newsletter. All the links you will need and access to the blog can be found at ronsamazingstories.com. Thank you for listening, and I hope you come again to find out what are Ron's Amazing Stories.
All of the vintage audio used in the podcast is believed to be in the public domain. Ron's Amazing Stories does not own the rights to any of the old-time radio used here. If you hold the rights to any of the shows played, please contact us immediately at ronsamazingstories.com.